Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another episode of our WCN Fluencer podcast. I'm your host, Christopher McClellan, and I have a special guest today. Well, Christy, all my guests are special, but you're equally as special because the Chris's have it today. What do you think?
I love it. I think it's great. And I feel very special. So this is awesome.
Well, and I kind of measure where my beard's going, if you can see my bow tie or not. And do I need a beard trim or do I, what do you think?
Maybe just a micro trim, but I think I can see the bottom. Yeah. Micro trim.
I like a micro trim. I like that because, it is kind of growing on me, but
yes, it truly is.
Christy, we're just kind of getting to know each other, but it seems like we have known each other for a while because when you think about caregiving, there's really no strangers when it comes to caregiving.
I can't agree with you more. I have been meeting so many people lately who are in this space, and it's like we knew each other from the get-go. It's really interesting.
Yeah, we know while the journeys are a little bit different, we know the path, we know the road, we know where you're going, we know where you've been, and that's why, goodness, there's just no strangers. We can feel comfortable with each other, no matter what our backgrounds are, what our religious beliefs, what orientation. Caregiving is indiscriminate.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because I was just meeting with somebody yesterday. Hadn't seen her in a couple of years. And we were talking, and same thing. We'd never really talked a lot about our caregiver journeys. And we started to find all these common things. Yeah, different circumstances in many ways, but that feeling core is
right.
A connector with people who have done caregiving or who are.
Yeah, I always like to tell the story. If I could just tell one of my stories for a moment, and say, I remember a fellow telling me on all these podcasts that we've done that, he was sitting in the lunchroom at work one day, and he was relatively new, and one of the employees come up, and I think it was one of the executives, and they really didn't have anything in common or what, how do you talk about it? You talk about baseball or sports or the weather. And one of them mentioned that they were taking care of their spouse. And it just so happened the other one was mentioning that they were taking care of their parents. And they had the shared experience of caregiving with having diversely different backgrounds, yet they found a common thread.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important to share our stories, because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And you have quite the story yourself.
Yeah. And what happens when we share our stories is we cease to feel so alone, because we can easily feel very alone in our caregiver journey. So I'm glad we're doing this. And I do have a story to tell.
You do have a story. I'm gonna get it out of you here eventually. But goodness, you're a licensed educational psychologist. That's a new term for me. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. But I should all let our listeners and our viewers know that you have joined the team at AlzAuthors as a co-host of Untangling Dementia and Alzheimer's. So this is just fantastic.
Yeah, I am really thrilled with that. I love the team at AlzAuthors, and Marianne and I were talking, Marianne Shuko, who's been the longtime host of that and really built it from scratch and has done an amazing job. We just connected well, and it just felt like a natural progression at that point, and I loved it. So I've done a couple with her already, and we'll be going forward co-hosting, and it's exciting. It's wonderful.
Well, Marianne, she's one of the original podcasters on the Whole Care Network.
Okay, that's great.
She and Elizabeth Miller have been since day one, which is I think 7 years now, and they've built their brands from scratch in a sense. And I say this to Marianne, so I said, it took me a few phone calls to get her to say, "Oh, I think this podcasting thing is going to work." But they're 7,000 to 8,000 downloads per show.
For sure.
They've built a wonderful brand, and they're bringing somebody very special on to help out.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted and extremely honored. So, yeah.
So tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about your background and your caregiving story.
Sure. As you said, I'm a licensed educational psychologist. I'm in California, and that I think is a very specific licensure in California. And you get to be a licensed educational psychologist once you've been a school psychologist in a school district for at least 2 years, met all of the educational requirements. But what it means is I'm a psychologist who can do any type of support, assessment, counseling, therapy to aid any age person in a learning or educational endeavor, right? So I can do the same things a school psychologist does. I often times as an LEP have done assessments for students or children or young adults, but I can also work with adults who maybe are going back to school or who have learned, wow, I was just identified as having ADHD. I need to understand this more. I've been diagnosed with having, or I've discovered I have dyslexia. I didn't know that, these things. This actually comes up a lot. Or I'm really anxious and stressed out about taking this course to be able to move ahead in my career. And so I can work with learning strategies and other kinds of things like that. So that's what I do as a licensed educational psychologist. In addition to that, it played a lot in my caregiving story because I was working in a school as a school psychologist, pretty demanding job, my husband and I had 2 kids we were raising, wonderful. They're adults now, young adults now. So we did something right. I don't know how that happened, but it all worked out. But I was also starting to care for my aging parents, both of whom eventually had some sort of dementia. My mother had Alzheimer's. My dad had vascular dementia. And for the last 4 years of their life, I was doing a lot of the management of their care. And I was struggling so hard with that because I was also raising these children who were wonderful and I loved being a mom. Right. But it really tore me apart. We talk about that as the sandwich generation and we talk about it being squeezed, but I always felt like I was pulled. And so kind of like Elastigirl from
you were a pulled sandwich then.
I was definitely, yeah. Oh my gosh, we could take that metaphor a lot of places.
I get it, yes.
But at one point, I really was struggling with what I was to be doing for my parents. I didn't give them hands-on care necessarily. They stayed in their home as long as they could, but they both had many years prior to retirement had established a living trust and a living will. And they bought a long-term healthcare insurance policy that only paid for assisted living or skilled nursing or that kind of thing. They really did not want to live with myself or my sister or my brother. They wanted to not do that. And so my job then was to kind of honor their wishes and help them along that way. But I still was involved in all their medical care, went to every doctor's appointment, things like that. And at one point I thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And what I did is I sort of conceptualized my job was being a case manager for my parents, just like I was a case manager at work with students. I just kind of put my parents on an IEP, right? In special education, we call that an individual education plan. And you have all these service providers. And that's kind of how I had to conceptualize it for my parents. Like I got doctors, I got the living staff that they're working with. And, it wasn't perfect, but it was what helped me kind of formulate a process to getting through because I was really struggling to keep it all together. And part of it is it changed how I parented my children, not always in great ways. There were plenty of times when I was not available to my kids emotionally in a way I wish I had been now. Looking back, I have regrets, but I also know my kids developed incredible levels of compassion, not only for my parents, their grandparents who they dearly loved, but for me. They really saw that this was hard for me to see my parents struggle. So while I have regrets, I also have enormous amounts of pride in how we all kind of work together as a family. But I do know that caregiving when you're raising kids compromises you as a parent on
Right.
a number of levels, and you have to just become aware of that to be able to then address it. But I wasn't aware of it for a long time, Chris. It really
Oh yeah,
was a
it just
shock.
it just because it just suddenly happens, and
Yeah.
your days go on, and they get busier, and you get more
Hmm.
responsibility, and then all of a sudden you're in this spiral of circles
Exactly.
going down and down and down, and having the opportunity to take a step back and look at it, and from a both a professional perspective and a personal perspective. But I'm kind of interested in how did you balance your knowledge as a psychologist
Yeah.
as as a parent? That emotional component of caregiving is always there,
Right.
but there's also that professional side too. And I've
Hmm.
always, at least for me personally, I've always had a hard time balancing when I
Hmm.
was in the midst of caring for Richard. Because I worked as a social worker, I thought, well, I know how
Right.
to do all this, but
Exactly.
I couldn't balance my emotions.
That's a great question. And I think, in terms of being a parent, that there were pluses and minuses to being a school psychologist.
Hmm.
On a lot of ways, I used to joke with my kids and say, "You're not going to be able to get away with much because I already see it every day at school. So, okay, just know mom knows." And it was I was joking, but it was also real too. Like, but when you're in it, and you probably experienced this too, you kind of alluded to that. When you're in it with your heart. And
Right.
sometimes that disconnects from our brain because this is the person we love. And oh my gosh, sometimes we can't always see what's going on with us and with
Let's see.
them. And we have to take a step back, or we have to rely on people around us to say, you might have some blinders on here. So humbling yourself to that, I think for
Yeah.
me, when I humbled myself to that I might not be seeing everything clearly, was good for me. So there were times when, with my children as their parent, I would talk to their teacher. Look, I'm seeing this, but what are you seeing? Because I'm their mom, and it may be a different story at home.
Right.
Or I had to check in with other people that I trusted so that I could see things more clearly. And I definitely had to do that with my parents too, because I'll be honest with you, I was in denial about my mom's Alzheimer's. People were saying to me, "Mom, Christy, we think something's wrong with your mom. She forgets a lot." And I was saying, "Oh no, she's just anxious. That's
She's
anxiety.
fine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's fine.
that's how she's always
Yeah,
been."
and she was worried about my dad's health. My dad was the one I was worried about. Oh, she's just worried about
Hmm.
dad. That's anxiety." And finally, I just had to say to myself, Christy, you need to look at this. So we talked to her doctor and had some evaluations, and it became pretty clear to me that she was really in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And once I could adjust to that, then I could start to. I didn't really. It didn't change how much I loved her and how much I wanted to care for her and interact with her, but I also saw there were things I needed to do a little differently.
Right. And
Yeah.
it helped both of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think sometimes I always like to use the phrase, and a lot of this was, most of it, if not all of it, was learned after the fact, that
Yeah.
our caregiving capes are limited,
Mm-hmm.
and we
Mm-hmm.
think that we can do it all, and we can change somebody's destiny because of that love, care, and commitment. But the cold hard facts is we just can't, and that's why and you just mentioned it's so important to listen to a trusted friend, that objective third
Mm-hmm.
person who can see things
Yeah.
that we can't see. Like, for instance, the last 6 months of Richard's life, he always got better. Oh, that's what, well, he's going to get better. And
Yeah.
then after seeing all the pictures the reporters took the last 6 months of his life, it's like, oh my, he would.
Yeah.
He was a lot sicker than I realized. And I think that's another reason why we all stay in this as advocates,
Yes.
to help that the next, who's going to be up next, because we're all going
Right.
to have a turn.
Right. Right. Exactly. We're all going to have a turn. And that was something that, you mentioned a lot of these things we learn after the fact. My parents died 7 weeks apart. My dad died first in July of 2015. And then 7 weeks later, my mother passed away. She died. And she actually died of a recurrence of cancer that we didn't know had come back.
Okay.
And because she was still really kind of, her Alzheimer's was increased. She was moving in that
Yeah.
path, but that's not what took her life. It really was the cancer. But it was after that, when I went back to work, people were just kind of, I got a lot of questions like, oh, Christy, how did you handle this? Or, oh, I'm kind of in that, I just had to put my dad on hospice, or, just different things. And I realized, we don't talk about this enough as a community.
No,
And
we certainly don't.
we stay isolated thinking we're just supposed to do this. But the reality is, we are all going to die, and we have to realize our loved ones are going to die. And how do we rise to that challenge to make that time period that's inevitable be one that's filled with love, intention, and it's challenging, Chris, because I had a wonderful relationship with my parents. But since I've been doing this work, I also have talked with a lot of friends and other folks that I've met who didn't have a great relationship with their parents.
Right.
And they may have had to come to terms with, how do they do this? How much can they do? How much are they willing to do? How are they feeling about that? How is that going to change them? Like, oh, here I am
Right.
again, taking care of mom, who I had to take care of all my life. That's a challenging situation.
That family baggage often enters into the picture, especially with adult children who end up, taking care of their parents who they have unresolved issues with. And as easy as this sounds, I know it's very hard, but sometimes we have to leave the baggage at the door and deal with those issues after this is all in, because that's the other part of this. There always is an ending.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we don't often talk about it. And it's one of the reasons why I stay in as an advocate, to talk about these difficult topics that need to be said, yet when they're finished, I'm looking for the right word here. It just makes, when that day comes and it does end, it makes for that day just to be a little bit easier, because you know exactly
Right.
what that person wanted, and you did everything that you could have done based on their own needs, not your own.
Right. Right. And for part of my message in talking to folks when I do this kind of work, the podcast, and I did write a book called Building a Legacy of Love, Thriving in the Sandwich Generation.
I was just about to get to that.
Well, and I want to say, the reason I entitled it that way is that, again, in the sandwich generation, you're raising your children and you're caring for your parents.
Right.
No matter what your relationship was to your parents, that's definitely going to impact how you're dealing with all of this.
Exactly.
But I see it as an opportunity for love for your children, right? That you can lead with love. If you can't say that about your parents, if it's really hard to say, I love my mother, so this is why I'm doing it. Maybe it's, I have to do it because she's my mother. Whatever that might be, having love for yourself, having compassion for yourself, and having love for your kids, right? Like, your kids are watching you. They're learning from you. And they might learn a lesson of resentment and obligation and stuff, or they might learn a lesson of forgiveness, leading with love, healthy boundaries. What are we teaching our kids when we're doing this? Because they're watching us all the time, and they're learning all the time.
Kid, it's that famous song. The play is skipping my mind. Kids will always listen. Oh, it'll come to me probably tonight when I'm.
That's right.
But really, you you going back to what you were saying about your parents, from what I heard is they were somewhat prepared. They had the policies. They had
Mm-hmm.
policies in place. They wanted to live as much as they could independently.
Yeah.
And that was I'm being risky when I say that was a nice lesson for you.
It was a beautiful lesson. That's
Yeah,
exactly what I say in my book.
yeah,
That was the
yeah,
legacy they left me.
yeah.
And it was an eye opener for my husband and I. I mean, our kids were, when all of this started, right? These last 4 years, our kids were
Yeah.
late tweens and early
Mm.
teens. And my son actually graduated high school in May of 2015. Then my dad passed away. So he lost both his grandparents just
That's
after
right
his high
away.
school graduation
Mm.
and just starting college and things like that. But my parents did leave me an incredible blessing. And that was, I didn't have to make a lot of decisions. They had already made those for me.
Right, right.
And I just had to be willing to follow their map. And I'm so grateful they did that, considering the fact that both of them ended up with a level of dementia that, had they never done anything, how could I have known what they wanted? They might not have been able to tell me.
Yeah.
So that spurred my husband and I on to, what do we have laid out? We need to think about ourselves for our kids, because that's a
Mm.
legacy I want to pass on to my kids, that, you don't have, because I was free to just be there and hold their hand. I didn't have to
Mm.
think about what they wanted at the end of life. I didn't have to think
It's
about
so
all of
important.
those measures. They had told me. And people don't always like to talk about these things.
Right.
And it's interesting. I had a conversation with a family, and there was an older gentleman, and he said, I don't like to talk about death. I don't like to talk about death. And I said, boy, I sure get that. That's really hard.
Yeah.
He said, but I want to push back a little bit and say, how about you just talk about life? And that this is about how you want to live till you're no longer living. How do you want to live?
Very
And
good.
those are the questions you want to think about. And he thought about it and he said, okay, all right, I can think about that. So,
Because it is a part of life, and
yeah.
having those open and honest conversations. And the other thing that I like to say also is when you're leaving your legacy, you're making it easier for the people who are left behind,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they don't have to worry about, did I do the right thing? Is this what
Right.
they had wanted? Because when you can follow the script,
Yeah.
it makes it just a tad bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have we known each other for like 30 or 40 years? I mean,
I
what's
feel
the
like
deal
it.
here?
I feel like it. I feel like
Yeah.
it. But right. I think I think that's why having those conversations early and being willing to revisit, because what you might think you want at 50, when you're starting to be 70 and 80, you might want to look at that again. Maybe things have changed, and your
Maybe things
values
have changed.
maybe not so much your values, but like what's really important to you might shift a little bit. Life changes us. And so it's not, but it's talking
Yeah.
about it, being
It's,
willing to talk about it and
and
setting some things up.
I think that's another reason why we do these podcasts and
Mm-hmm.
have awesome guests like yourself who are making a difference, who have written a wonderful book and now co-hosting a podcast.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
let's talk about the AlzAuthors. It's one of the popular podcasts on the Holker Network, Untangling Dementia and Alzheimer's. Sometimes I get those reversed, but that's part of my dyslexia.
It's okay.
But you've recorded a couple of episodes already. So
Yeah.
how are you feeling as a co-host?
Oh, great question. I love it. It's wonderful. The authors that are brought into the family of AlzAuthors are amazing, right? They're every book is read word for word before you're offered to be a part of the group. So it's not like everybody who wants to be there is there. And I'm not a person. I'm an inclusive person, not an exclusive person. But I also like being part of a group that's trying to promote things that are really value driven and well written and can be helpful for people. And that's what I find in AlzAuthors. This is an amazing group of volunteers that have put this together. Jean Lee, Vicky Tapia, Marianne Shuko, they put together something just incredible. And it was just inspired by their own caregiving journeys. And now they've brought in other authors who are sharing aspects of that as well. And so there's something for everyone. I also then, as a school psychologist, I oftentimes recommend to families books that might help parents through certain things, right? Well, there's some great children's books about how to talk to kids about Alzheimer's, how to talk about what's happening with grandma, what does this mean? And so that you can help kids understand this very difficult thing. And it's great. So I'm really proud of it. And I just think Marianne's just done such a top-notch job with this podcast. So I'm excited.
Well, you can't be connected with a better group than Marianne and her folks. And we're so thrilled to have you a part of the Whole Care Network. And I might tickle you just a little bit to have your own podcast as well. I think the sandwich generation with Christy Yates. You never know. We might be able to make that happen. But Christy,
and there are a lot of sandwiches, Chris. There are a lot of different sandwiches.
There are a lot. We could. Oh my goodness. There are a lot of sandwiches. We'll be whipping those up in the kitchen. I see you got my mind going now. I've got a gazillion ideas on how we can pull this off. That would be fun. But so Christy, let all of our viewers and listeners know how they can learn more about you, where they can purchase your book and be in touch with you.
Okay, great. I have a website. It's Christy Yates. It's just ChristyYates.com. So ChristyYates.com. You can find my book there. It's available on Amazon. And there is a ebook version, a paperback version, and I recorded it on Audible. And I did that because I know that you all out there who are caregivers don't always have time to sit down and listen to a book, but you might be in the car and you have time to listen to a book. So I think that was something that was helpful. And I have a YouTube channel with a few things that might be helpful for people, some self-care kinds of techniques that are really soothing to the soul and helpful, and a couple of informational things. And I'm growing that channel. And that's another thing I do with AlzAuthors, is trying to grow their YouTube channel. So this technology is so great for caregivers. It really helps people to be able to access the information they don't know they need until they find it. There you go.
I know technology has impacted so many industries, but I know when I back in 2011, when I started in this, there was a few places you can go to on the net, but not like you can today.
Right.
And then I get the opportunity to meet awesome people like yourself who are making a difference.
Well, thank you.
We're so thrilled to have you a part of the Whole Care Network. We want to get you involved in Whole Care Network University as well, but
well,
Christy,
I'm working on my e-course for that, Chris. It's fantastic. No, I think Whole Care Network is brilliant, and I am so honored to be a part of it as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a labor of love, and
clearly,
once started out as a hobby, is now. I know we just went over 540,000 downloads of our podcast this week. So it's
congratulations.
We're doing something right. But Christy, with the great work that you're doing, you are certainly a WC influencer, and I am tickled to death to have you join the network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris.